Everybody up here has done such a phenomenal job that a lot of what I was going to do has already been done. So I'm going to actually do this fairly swiftly so that I could maybe yield a few minutes back so that Maggie can have her moment that she really deserves, and I'd really like to see the end of that video. I don't know about everyone else. So we've been talking around this, but one of the reasons why this briefing is really important today is that there is no statutory definition for ultra rare in the US. And we maybe should have started with that for those that don't know that. But there are a number of definitions that are floating about and are used in different contexts in different ways. And there are just a few examples of those up here. And we do have entities in the US that have developed definitions that are being utilized, but there is no definition here in the US. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which we won't go into. But I will do a little commercial for the fact that there is a scientific workshop being convened tomorrow by EveryLife, where scientific and regulatory leaders are coming together to talk about the potential for the consequences of developing a definition, and whether or not that would actually be a numeric threshold or a characterization, and how that could potentially be beneficial. That said, in advance of that scientific workshop, we disseminated a survey to the patient advocacy organization leaders that would be attending that workshop. So these are stakeholders who are super invested in ultra rare, such as Ethan and Christine, who are sitting here beside me, who are leading organizations and driving development in the ultra rare space themselves. And we asked them to complete a survey around their perceptions and their characterization of ultra rare. And this is just a snapshot of some of the input that we received, just to show that even among those expert stakeholders, there are a lot of differences of opinion around where that threshold might be. And this is just a quick snapshot of that numeric threshold. So as a community, it's really important that we do have a scientific discussion around this, and to better understand how that threshold would be used and what the potential implementation of that could look like. So this presentation is really about what we need in order to be able to solve for ultra rare. How do we make sure that we change outcomes for individuals living with ultra rare diseases in the US? And so we really are categorizing that in a few different, we're talking a lot about buckets up here. And so we can call them buckets, we can call them puzzle pieces, but how do we ensure that there are more incentives for developing therapies in the ultra rare space? Christine really gave a very striking example of what happens when there aren't more incentives. And so just to really make it clear, part of the difficulty and challenge in ultra rare is that the incentive for a company to develop a product in ultra rare is not the same as the incentive for if you're doing male pattern hair loss or arthritis. The market share just isn't there. And so we really have to think about what are the incentives? How do we de-risk that space for an investor or for a company to work in that space? And so these incentives are critically important. Resources. We have to make sure that the stakeholders who are working in these spaces are resourced to do this work. And the question is, do we need to resource them additionally above and beyond how others working in the space are resourced? And that is a really important policy area for us to be working in. And that really leads to the ultra rare policies. And those working in ultra rare are disadvantaged above and beyond those in even the more broader rares, and those certainly in the more chronic spaces. And then infrastructure. Infrastructure is difficult across the board, and especially when we think about ultra rare. And so just a couple examples, and these are certainly not going to be an exhaustive list, but my colleague, Dr. Ndu, already talked about the Creating Hope Reauthorization Act, and she did a really beautiful job talking about this, so I'm not going to belabor it. But the Pediatric Priority Review Voucher has been an incredibly important incentive, so in that incentive category for developing products in rare diseases, and this is an incredibly important incentive in the ultra rare space. We cannot afford for this incentive to go away. There are already too few incentives in rare, and we must ensure that this gets reauthorized. We are very close. This was a part of that markup last Thursday, and we need to make sure that we get this one over the finish line. Another category that we talk about are resources, and one way that we work on those resources here on the Hill is through appropriations. These are 3 categories that we have been working on as a rare disease community around appropriations and making sure that our federal agency partners are resourced. But just a couple examples around how this becomes really incredibly complex and incredibly important when we think about ultra rare. Christine talked about newborn screening. So newborn screening is an area that is, we know, to be life-saving in rare disease, but we also know this is a public health program. And so when the Secretary's Advisory Committee of Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children thinks about the benefit and risk of adding a condition to that screen, they think about the cost of adding a screen. And so what will happen when it's an ultra-rare condition that they're considering be added, because they're now going to have to screen a whole population for an ultra-rare condition. EveryLife actually offered testimony last week, as did many others in the rare community, to say that we argue for the fact that we must ensure that we are working to save the life of every baby in the nation, regardless of how often that condition occurs. But that is something that we have to say is a moral imperative, regardless of incidence and prevalence, that we continue to fight for. But that comes up in the context of public health. Translational research. So this is another category. We just heard a really important presentation on what NCATS is working on. We have to make sure that NCATS and then FDA, and there's another section of this slide that talks about the orphan products grants programs, are resourced adequately and then additionally incentivized to make sure that as those funds and those projects are being prioritized, that small populations and ultra-rare populations are being able to be focused on and worked on. This is a priority area when we think about policy areas. So we have just a couple things we'll flag on policy areas. ICD codes. So if you're in this room and you're a staffer, you may not know what an ICD code is, but an ICD code is your International Classification of Disease. I like to think of it as your hashtag that follows you throughout all of your medical records. So it's high blood pressure, it's pregnancy, it's sutures. You have a hashtag for any medical encounter that you have. Out of the more than 10,000 rare diseases, fewer than 600 of them have an ICD code, which means that rare diseases are essentially invisible in the healthcare system. And this is a barrier from a multitude of reasons, and it is one that is surmountable. We can fix this, but we actually need to develop policies that help us do that. A couple other policy issues. Christine talked about, at the very beginning of her presentation, she did a beautiful job talking about why off-label products are so important in the GM1 population, because so few rare diseases have approved products for that specific rare disease. So many patients take products that have not been approved specifically for their rare disease, but can treat the symptoms associated with rare disease. They're very difficult, though, to get reimbursed when they're off-label. There is a bill here in Congress, the Protect Rare Act, that would work to address that. So policies that look to help overcome hurdles to access that specifically address issues that would target our ultra-rare community are incredibly important. And then Dr. Ndu talked about the accelerated approval pathway, and she talked about PDABs, which are incredibly important. I would also just highlight that in the end of 2022, FDORA, or the Food and Drug Omnibus Reauthorization Act, included enhancements to the accelerated approval pathway that were incredibly important. But one of them is one that I would just like to highlight because it became a little bit of a barrier to ultra-rare. So when we solve for other problems, sometimes we create problems elsewhere. One of them was that the FDA is now permitted to require that a confirmatory trial be underway at the time that a product is approved. So that was something that happened during FDORA. If you are a company that has never had a product approved before, which often happens in small biotechs, and you have an accelerated approval product that is now moving through the regulatory space based on a surrogate, so that's what's happening in accelerated approval, and you're now going to potentially be required by FDA to get ready to stand up your phase 4, your confirmatory trials, before you know if FDA has approved that product. before you know if FDA has decided that your surrogate is confirmed, you're asking small biotechs that don't have a financial runway to invest in post-market studies. But the other thing that happens, so that's a problem for all rare companies, but especially in ultra-rare, that company has probably exhausted the whole US population and the ultra-rare population for their studies. So you're probably asking those companies to have to go outside the US to design those trials and recruit for those trials. They're going to have to set up new trial sites and recruit new patients. We're asking companies to do something that is almost impossible and definitely beyond their affordability. So we need to think about the ultra-rare community when we think about developing these policies. Okay, and then the last bucket is infrastructure. And we have been, as a rare community, moving forward proposals to develop infrastructure that works better for the rare disease community and just makes sense. And we're not just making this up. We're looking at models that work in other communities. So one of that is the FDA Rare Disease Center of Excellence. And FDA already has the congressional authority to develop centers of excellence, and we've seen this work beautifully in oncology, and we would like to see that work in rare disease. The other is we have seen interagency coordinating committees work beautifully. So coordinating committees where we bring together NIH, FDA, CMS, the Social Security Administration, HRSA, to work together to share what their agendas in rare are, and then develop shared agendas to knock down obstacles and increase momentum in rare disease. And so that is a separate request that we are asking for the establishment of an interagency coordinating committee in rare diseases. So thank you so much. There is so much that we can do even before we have determined whether and what an ultra-rare definition would be. And then so much more we will be able to do after we have come together to discuss that. And that discussion is happening tomorrow. Please look for the link. Thank you.